Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that his government on Monday supported a white supremacist slogan in the Senate, on Tuesday upended 70 years of bipartisan foreign policy, and today the former Deputy Prime Minister is doing the numbers to depose the current Deputy Prime Minister? How can the Prime Minister claim that a vote for the Liberals in Wentworth is a vote for stability when he refuses to explain to Australians why Malcolm Turnbull is no longer Prime Minister?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Members on both sides.
Speaker,
the Prime Minister has the call.
Give the economy a run.
The Leader of the Opposition really does need to grow up, Mr Speaker. He really does. There are important issues that we are dealing with on a daily basis: the economy, the drought, the residential aged care inquiry. We're working to ensure that we have a strong economy that can support Medicare, that can provide affordable medicines, that can keep Australians safe. And all the Leader of the Opposition wants to do is drudge around in this building in the bubble of politics, Mr Speaker. What the Leader of the Opposition is demonstrating to the Australian people is that he is just another politician in a suit, Mr Speaker. This is a Leader of the Opposition who the Australian people have no idea what he believes. They have no idea what he stands for. All they know, Mr Speaker, is that this Leader of the Opposition is about one thing: himself. He cannot put forward a set of beliefs that he can hold from one part of the country to the other. He says one thing in one part of the country to one audience and then another thing to another part of the country, Mr Speaker. What the Australian people can know about me and our government is our beliefs are clear, our principles are clear, our policies are clear, our results are clear. More than 1 million jobs created under the policies of our government, backing in small business, ensuring record funds for health and for education, backing in Medicare, ensuring we're listing the PBS drugs, which when the Labor Party was running the government they couldn't afford to do it because they didn't know how to manage a strong economy and they didn't know how to manage a budget. I would suggest to the Leader of the Opposition to get out of the gutter of the politics and to focus on the issues that are of national interest to all Australians, Mr Speaker. Now, on the issues of foreign policy, we have no problem with Australians deciding the issues we should be talking about in this country, any more than we have any issue with Australians deciding who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come, Mr Speaker. On that side of the House, we have the member for Sydney who thinks that Israel is a rogue state, Mr Speaker. The member for Sydney has come into this place as a member of this House and called Israel a rogue state. Now, I don't know, Mr Speaker, if the member for Melbourne Ports agrees with that or the member for Wills agrees with that. Perhaps members over here do agree with that, Mr Speaker. I have no idea what the member for Watson and the member for McMahon think about these questions of support for Israel, but I do know the Australian Jewish community can trust one party in this chamber, the Liberal and the National parties.
Members on both sides will cease interjecting. The member for Grayndler, the member for Sydney will cease interjecting. The members for Moreton and Bruce interject constantly. They're warned, as is the member for Wills, for the same reason. The member for Leichhardt has the call.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister advise how the government's core beliefs and principles are working to deliver policies that provide a stronger economy, guarantee essential services Australians rely on, keep Australians safe and keep Australians together?
The Prime Minister has the call.
And I thank the member for Leichhardt for his question, and I welcome all those members of the Cairns convoy, which has come to Canberra this week, the TNQ convoy, and I congratulate him on his working relationship with his local community. Mr Speaker, our beliefs as Nationals and Liberals, our beliefs as coalition parties is what drives our agenda for a stronger economy, for guaranteeing the essential services Australians rely on, keeping Australians safe and keeping Australians together. Our beliefs about a fair go for those who have a go. Our beliefs that a fairer society is always created by ensuring it's a more prosperous society, by ensuring our economy grows, and we do not do things that slow the growth of our economy. That's what fairness is, Mr Speaker, in this country, when you pursue prosperity together with a fair agenda which gives a fair go to those who have a go. We believe the best form of welfare is a job, Mr Speaker, and we also believe that you don't lift people up in this country by pulling others down, Mr Speaker, which is the politics of envy which is pursued by the Labor Party and championed by this leader of the Labor Party, the Jeremy Corbyn of Australian politics, Mr Speaker. And we believe that our policies on defence and on foreign affairs and on border security should be decided in Australia, not decided by the instructions of anywhere else, Mr Speaker. We are a sovereign country, and that's why we believe in lower taxes and are delivering lower taxes. That's why we believe Australians should be keeping more of what they earn, and that's why we support lower taxes. It's why we support small and medium-sized businesses and family businesses, and the Labor Party opposes them by putting higher taxes on them and not supporting laws that give small businesses a level playing field. It's why we support trade deals, which is opening up markets where those opposite have used everything they can to try and frustrate our agenda to expand trade relationships for our country. It's why we support our farmers with $1.8 billion of support for those farmers in rural communities affected by drought. It's why we have a cop on the beat in the Australian Building and Construction Commission, because we believe the rule of law should apply right across the Australian economy and particularly in the building and construction industry. But the Labor Party wants the lawbreakers in the union movement to be the lawmakers, Mr Speaker, when it comes to industrial laws in this country. It's why we are bringing the budget back into balance. It's why we've been able to retain the AAA credit rating so we can pay for Medicare and pay for all of our commitments when it comes to schools and when it comes to hospitals. Australians know what we believe, Mr Speaker. You need an atlas to understand what the Leader of the Opposition and the Labor Party believes, because he says one thing and believes one thing in one part of the country and another in another, Mr Speaker. That's why you can't trust this Leader of the Labor Party. You don't know what he believes, and when you don't know what someone believes, you don't know what they'll do.
Has concluded. The member for Hunter.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Yesterday in question time he said, and I quote, "I will never ever background a journalist." Does he stand by that answer? And is he aware that Ray Hadley said today that the office of the current Deputy Prime Minister was the source of many of the leaks against the former Deputy Prime Minister, and that people in glass houses should not throw stones?
Excuse me, the Minister for Agriculture will cease interjecting. I'm struggling to see how that question is in order, and in doing that, before I call the Manager of Opposition Business, in the interest of being upfront, I always review question time, and in reviewing yesterday's question time, I feel I did err in not ruling yesterday's question out of order, having looked at the text of it. I can't see how the question's in order. I'm happy to hear from the Manager of Opposition Business and then the Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, yesterday in question time, the Deputy Prime Minister made a number of statements, and it should be in order for us to be allowed to whether or not he stands by those statements. It's also clear in practice that ministers are meant to be across what has been said in the media in their portfolios. That's specifically referred to. When something's been said in the media that contradicts what was said yesterday, it should be right and proper for us to ask whether he stands by his answer.
The Leader of the House.
Well, Mr Speaker, ministers are responsible for matters within their portfolio, and they're specifically in the standing orders not responsible for the comments and statements of media commentators, for example, and nor really responsible for allegations made anonymously about their office doing or not doing something. So certainly, in terms of the part of the question about whether he stood by a statement he's already made in the House, that may well be in order, but the rest of the question is not in order.
Yes, I think certainly the bit about yesterday's answer and standing by the statements in order. The rest of the question and references to media commentary is not in order, and the only reason that part of the question today is in order is because I failed to rule yesterday's question out of order, which I should have. So I'm making that very, very clear. The member for Hunter is lucky, but I'll be listening very carefully to any other questions he has. The Deputy Prime Minister will address himself to that part of the question that asks him to whether he stands by his statement yesterday, and he doesn't need to address any of the material other than that. Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I hear the shadow infrastructure say less is more, but in the infrastructure portfolio we are providing more. We are providing $75 billion, a record amount of infrastructure. And the shadow Minister for infrastructure knows full well that we are making sure that we build the roads, the ports, the aviation and the railway lines, getting people home.
I just say to the Deputy Prime Minister, I've tried to be generous, but I can't see how the answer's in order now.
More to the shadow minister's question. I stand by everything that I've said in this House. I have never misled this House. I have not misled the Parliament, and indeed I stand by everything that I've said both in this House and as a member of Parliament. Just like I stand by the fact that I stood by my irrigators when the member for Watson threatened to take their water away from them. Just like I stood by my electorate when Labor members threatened to take away all the Building Better Regions programs that are put in place. Mr Speaker, I stood by them. Just like I've stood by the fact that, Mr Speaker, we are investing in our regions when under Labor regional funding programs went to the member for Lawler's electorate, when Julia Gillard was the member for Watson's electorate, when they should have been going to country electorates. Just like I've stood up. I've always stood up for regional people. I always will stand up for regional people, and I stand by the comments I made then. I stand by the comments I make now.
The member for Calare.
Well, my question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on why the government believes in supporting small business and how the government is acting on that belief to grow country communities and help those who are dealing with the drought? And what is at stake if our plan to continue to build a vibrant regional Australia is placed at risk?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Clare for his question. I believe in strong economic management. I believe that when you earn money, you should be able to keep more of that money. Those opposite believe in taking it away, in funding the big tax whack that they stand up for. That's what they stand up for. We believe in allowing people who work hard, who earn money, to keep more of that money that they earn. We believe in supporting country communities. I've just finished talking about, in my previous answer, about how I believe in standing up for regional communities, as does all the Liberals, as do all the Nationals. We believe there is a bright future ahead for regional Australia, and we're standing up for those regional Australians who deserve better than to hear the inside Canberra questions being asked of the government. They should be asking questions about regional Australia. They should be asking questions about the economy, but they just want to go into these beltway tactics that people who are listening to this telecast, watching it on their television, they don't understand why they're not. Why those opposite, who once stood up for shearers, who once stood up for high-vis workers, who once stood up for coal miners, they can't understand why they're not standing up more for regional communities. I mean, the Labor Party was formed on shearers, on coal miners, but you're not standing up for them. We believe in small businesses. Those opposite do not. They just want to get out the big tax sledgehammer and whack them even harder. And I can't understand it. The Liberals can't understand it. The Nationals can't understand why you want to take the big tax whack to small business, to family enterprises who work hard, who deserve to keep more of the money that they earn. Businesses such as, in the member who asked me the question, in his electorate, the Central West of New South Wales, where Michelle and Angus Price-Jones, they own Hill and Crofts CRT in Blaney. Angus and Michelle have owned
Ward.
Hill & Croft since 2001. The store has 4 employees. Look, not large in the scheme of things, but 4 workers. They're getting on with making sure that those people have a future, those people have prosperity. And that little business has a turnover of $4.5 million. They're punching well above their weight. And look, they are serving the public. They're serving certainly in the agriculture space. They're certainly serving them in the residential real estate space in Blaney. And they're people who will be targeted if Labor's negative gearing policies ever become law. So that's right, Labor just wants to take the property tax whack out. They want to make sure that people don't have the sort of money in their investments that they should have because they've worked hard, they've invested in real estate. They should be able to get ahead. We've also put $1.8 billion in drought relief measures, and in the member for Clare's electorate, they will help for those councils getting the $1 million. They're going to help Blaney, Cabonne, Midwestern Regional, Oberon and Dubbo Regional. Good councils getting on with the job of making sure that their communities are well served, bringing local infrastructure works forward, getting money flowing into drought-affected communities.
The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm today's reports that he first informed the President of Indonesia of his decision to overturn 70 years of bipartisan foreign policy via a text message? Is the Prime Minister really so panicked about Wentworth that he's willing to make the most cynically timed foreign policy decision in living memory? Why is the Prime Minister so reckless with our foreign policy?
Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, Australians will know this about me, that what I believe today is what I will believe next week and what I'll believe a month from now, Mr Speaker. When I went to Israel with the now Leader of the Opposition, only one of us seems to have remembered the lessons of that trip, Mr Speaker, because our government, the Liberal and the National parties, we stand with Israel. I don't know what the Labor Party thinks anymore, Mr Speaker. Some of their the member for Sydney, thinks that Israel is a rogue state, Mr Speaker, and she has come into that place and she has said this as a member of the House of Representatives and called Israel a rogue state, Mr Speaker. Now, I don't believe Israel is a rogue state. No one on this side of the House believes that Israel is a rogue state. So, Mr Speaker, I don't know what the bipartisanship is that the Leader of the Labor Party speaks of when it comes to this place's support for the State of Israel. I don't know what that bipartisanship is
Prime Minister
they
resume
refer
his
to.
seat. Member for Jellybrand will cease interjecting. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Point of order on direct relevance. The question goes to whether the President of Indonesia was advised by text message.
That was one part of the question, but there are a number of other parts, and when you look at them all, it had the diversity of a food court, I have to say. The Prime Minister has the call.
So, if I listen to the question from the Leader of the Opposition, so will next week after the Wentworth by-election, will the Leader of the Labor Party tell us what his views are on Jerusalem, on the issue of Iran? Will he tell us next week? Why won't he tell us this week, Mr Speaker? He wants to talk about process this week. Well, my answer on those questions are the same today as they'll be next week, Mr Speaker. He seems to have forgotten the fact that earlier this morning, in the General Assembly of the United Nations, Australia voted no for Palestine to chair the G77. I haven't heard boo from the opposition about this, Mr Speaker. I don't know what the Leader of the Labor Party thinks on these questions anymore. I don't know what he believes in, Mr Speaker. I can say I'm not sure I've ever known what he believes in. It depends on what part of the country's in. You don't just need an atlas. You just don't need an atlas to understand what he thinks and what he says. You also need a calendar, because it changes from day to day to day, Mr Speaker. The Liberal and the National Party's view when it comes to a two-state solution is very clear. And our position when it comes to the support of Israel is very, very clear, Mr Speaker. When it comes to the Labor Party, they are the box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get.
Just before I call the member for Melbourne, I'd like to inform the House that we have joining us in the gallery this afternoon the former President of Kiribati, His Excellency Anote Tong. On behalf of the House, It's a very warm welcome to you. And while I'm doing some welcomes, because I also welcome the many former members and senators who are with us today for part of their annual reunion. The member for Melbourne.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Kids need to grow up in a stable, loving environment. But under your watch, the refugee children on Nauru are in absolute crisis. And when a 10-year-old boy repeatedly tried to kill himself, your government refused to transfer him to Australia for treatment until a court ordered it. And as emergency grows into catastrophe, Australia's senior medical officer was reportedly arrested and is today being deported from Nauru. Why are you slowly killing these children? Are you seriously arguing that threatening these children's lives is some kind of necessary evil, acceptable because you want to send some kind of broader message? Why won't you accept doctors' advice that it's never in a child's best interest to lock them up until they die?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Sorry.
The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, clearly the member for Melbourne has overstepped the boundaries even in this building, and I would ask him to withdraw those insinuations and statements that we are trying to kill children by locking them up.
I'd ask the member for Melbourne to withdraw.
I'm prepared to rephrase the question if that
No,
part of the
you
question.
Members on my right will cease interjecting.
Why is the
Deputy Prime
government
Minister.
slowly killing these children?
No, look, the member for Melbourne needs to withdraw. A rephrase doesn't do it. He needs to withdraw. There's one rule for everyone, I'm afraid.
I withdraw that part of the question.
Thank you. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, our government, when we came to government in 2013, ended the carnage of children dying at sea. We ended the carnage, and we did it in 3 months to stop that carnage from happening. We've took 6,000 children out of detention because of our policies. We closed the detention centres that the Labor Party opened because of their inability to manage Australia's borders, as children lay face down in the water at the urging of the policies of the Greens, Mr Speaker, who they so happily went along with, Mr Speaker. So I'm not going to take lectures from the Greens movement, who are more responsible than any in this chamber for their reckless attitude as they seek to stand here and aggrandise themselves.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Melbourne on a point of order.
On relevance, it was clear from the opening of the question that this was about the children on Nauru. My question is about that, and I want an answer about that. If you could ask the Prime Minister to be directly relevant to that.
The Prime Minister is addressing the subject of the question. There was a specific element to the question, and the Prime Minister is entitled to give some comparisons and to give some context, but the question was about Nauru. The Prime Minister.
Thank the Speaker. Mr Speaker, our commitment to providing the health and medical services is on record on the facilities that were opened by the Labor Party when they were in office, and we will continue to treat every single case based on the medical advice that is received and transfers that are undertaken on the basis of that medical advice, and we will continue to pursue that practice in each and every case. But I'll ask the Minister for Home Affairs to add to the answer.
The member for Macarthur will cease interjecting. The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for his question. As the Prime Minister outlined, firstly, there are about 65 medical professionals on Nauru at the moment. The Australian government has provided some hundreds of millions of dollars to medical services on Nauru. In fact, there have now been around about 200 children who have come as part of family units where a father or a mother may have come down to Australia for medical assistance, and they've come as part of that family unit, or indeed they've come down for medical assistance themselves. So there are many cases, Mr Speaker, where the Australian government has provided support. I'd make the point that we have been able to negotiate an arrangement with the United States where now 435 people have left from Nauru and from Manus. People that had arrived as part of the 50,000 on 800 boats when Labor was last in government. Those people have formed part of what I hope will be a bigger number heading off to the United States, and will continue to work on a number of cases as we are, as the Minister for Immigration is on a daily basis in relation to this matter. As the Prime Minister rightly points out, we take the advice from the medical experts. We have a look at the
The member for Melbourne has asked his question.
Well, again, Mr. Speaker, I think Australians are better to stick to the facts, because if they don't, they are led by people like the honourable member that asked the question, and what results, as the Prime Minister detailed before, could easily be repeated if that man is ever involved in public policy.
The member for Fairfax.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Will the Minister update the House on why the government believes in an ambitious trade agenda that creates jobs and new opportunities for Australian businesses? And what are the risks from alternative approaches?
The Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Trade and Investment.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And today is a good day for trade. It's a good day for trade because the Coalition, the Liberal and the National parties, have delivered on our vision of making sure that we are driving economic growth in this country and driving jobs in this country. And we believe, as Liberals and Nationals together, in the benefits to all Australians of free trade. We believe in creating more economic opportunity for small businesses, and we believe in backing in those small businesses, because we, as Liberals and Nationals, fundamentally understand that trade is good news for Australian workers and good news for Australian exporters. And that's the reason why, as a government, we have been so deeply committed to opening up trade agreements. In fact, since 2013, the Liberal and National Party have opened and concluded 8 free trade agreements, including the North Asian FTAs with China, Japan and Korea, the comprehensive update that took place with Singapore, PACER Plus, the Peru-Australia Free Trade Agreement, the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which we've delivered, and, of course, the TPP-11. And I've got to throw a flower toward Labor, one flower towards Labor, and that's the fact that Labor did support the enabling legislation in the Senate. But I've got to say, when it comes to trade, we really don't know what Labor believes at all, because fundamentally the Australian Labor Party on trade is a complete house of cards. And should Bill Shorten ever become the Prime Minister of this country, should the Leader of the Opposition ever become the Prime Minister of this country, we know that the collapse of that house of cards will see a collapse in trade policy in this country. Because we don't know what Labor believes on trade. We know, and Australians know, we believe in creating economic opportunity. We know and Australians know that we believe in creating jobs for Australians through trade. In fact, more than 1 million have been created in this country under our watch. But Labor's policy still remains so unclear, and that confusion manifests in lots of different ways, Mr. Speaker. You see it because the left have become so rambunctious because they're unhappy with where the leader's going, and you also see it from others who know the fundamental importance of trade, who are displeased that the Australian Labor Party has no consistency and no clear compass for where they're going on trade. The simple fact is that Labor's policy on trade is clear. In 6 years, they were unable to start and conclude a single trade deal. So compare and contrast a government that knows what it believes, that puts in place export opportunities, that drives economic jobs, that drives economic growth, that creates jobs, compared to an Australian Labor Party that is completely lost when it comes to trade in this country.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Environment Minister. I refer to the government's almost $500 million grant to the Great Barrier Reef Foundation. How much of that money can be spent on administration and scaling up activities?
The Minister for the Environment.
I'd like to thank the member for his question. Good opportunity to talk about the reef, Speaker. We know that this $440 million reef grant to the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, we all know that the reef requires enormous amount of effort in terms of the science needed, and there is enormous amount of work that's been done in terms of the... There's a considerable amount of work that's been done already by the foundation. We've already identified $200 million with respect to water, a significant amount of money to research more broadly, significant amount of money to resilience, and also a small amount of money with respect to administration.
The member for Canning.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Members on my left, the member for Canning has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is for the Treasurer.
Member for Canning, pause. Members on my right, including the Deputy Prime Minister, are preventing the don't dob on the Leader of the House being heard. The member for Canning will begin his question again.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is for the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer outline to the House how this government is growing the Australian economy and how that economic growth is helping Australian families, workers and businesses? Will the Treasurer share with the House what he sees are the biggest threats to the Australian economy?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Canning for his question. And I'm glad to get a question on the economy, Mr Speaker, because the Labor Party has delivered more invisible surpluses than the member for McMahon has had questions in this place, Mr Speaker. More invisible surplus than the member for McMahon has asked questions in this place. Now, as the member for Canning knows, when you grow the economy, you create jobs and you can provide the essential services that the Australian people need and deserve, Mr Speaker. And we have been growing the economy at 3.4% through the year. We have created more than 1 million new jobs. We have had our AAA credit rating reaffirmed recently, and we have it from the 3 leading rating agencies. We have delivered a budget deficit for 17-18, which is at its lowest level in a decade, and we are on track to come back to balance in 1920, a year earlier than expected, Mr Speaker. Now, these are the results of a government which believes in lower taxes, Mr Speaker, a government that believes in lower regulation, Mr Speaker, a government that believes in more free trade, Mr Speaker, and a government that believes in rewarding people for hard work, Mr Speaker. And as Sir Robert Menzies said more than 70 years ago, it's the Liberal Party that believes in the power of the individual and their enterprise. And it's the Liberal Party that rejects the socialist panacea put by those opposite, Mr Speaker. Now the Labor Party is getting arrogant, Mr Speaker. As we get closer to an election, they think it's in the bag, Mr Speaker. They are taking the Australian people for granted, Mr Speaker, and we're starting to get a closer look at what they believe. Like the member for Lilley, the incoming president of the Labor Party, who said that Labor's goal was to tear down neoliberalism, Mr Speaker. And he was praising Bernie Sanders, Mr Speaker, as the Labor Party has rejected the legacy of Hawke and Keating and embraced the Corbyn-Sanders approach, Mr Speaker. And the member for Fenner, he gave a speech praising Friedrich Engels of Marx and Engels' fame, Mr Speaker. And the member for Sydney, Mr Speaker, we all know what the member for Sydney said. Aspiration is a mystery, Mr Speaker. That's what we've heard from the member for Sydney. And we know that the ACTU Secretary, if Labor gets to government, will be counselling the Cabinet on which laws do not apply to them, Mr Speaker. That is what we're going to see from a Labor Party in government. Higher taxes, higher spending, union domination and a view that government always knows best. In contrast, the Liberal Party and the National Party believe in the individual and their enterprise.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Environment Minister. I refer to her previous answer where she said only a small amount of money could be spent on administration. Can the Minister please advise the House what that small amount of money is?
The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member opposite. The number is 5%.
The member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Jobs, Industrial Relations and Women. Will the minister update the House on why the government believes in a fair and a sustainable taxation system and what the government is doing to act on this belief through its support for small business? What are the risks for small business from different ideas?
The Minister for Jobs, Industrial Relations and Women.
I thank the member for Robertson for her question, and she is absolutely passionate about the more than 15,000 small businesses in her electorate of Robinson and is a very powerful voice for them. She is, of course, someone who, like every other member on this side of the chamber, believes passionately in small business, and that is one of the reasons why our government is delivering tax relief to small and family-sized businesses sooner than more than 3 million small businesses that employ more than 7 million Australians. Unfortunately, though, those opposite don't really support small business. Those opposite believe in higher and higher taxes for small business. For those small businesses, for instance, that have a trust, they will tax those small businesses. For those small businesses that actually employ people who want a salary sacrifice to save for their retirement income, they would in fact scrap that. They don't support small business, and they certainly don't support the people that work for small business. But it's not just on the issue of tax where those opposite would damage small business and the people that work for them. At the behest of the donors of the Labor Party, the ACTU, they would shut down entire industries at a time, costing jobs and closing down small businesses. The Leader of the Opposition has a plan to scrap the tough cop on the beat in the building and construction industry, and he would allow militant unions to run riot, to bully and intimidate small business people and the people that work for them. Mr Speaker, we are all aware and very familiar with the rule of law. It applies equally to all, whether you be a barista, a cleaner, a doctor or a lawyer. But under the Leader of the Opposition, there would be a new law of the land, and it would be known as Sally's Law, which says you can break the law whenever you like. And we certainly know that Sally's Law would very soon become Bill's Law, and he would make the lawbreakers the lawmakers. The Coalition supports small business and the people that work for them. While the former leaders of the Labor Party have given the militant unions an IOU, this Leader of the Opposition, he would give them a blank cheque, and it will be every single hard-working Australian who will be footing the bill.
The member for Port Adelaide.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Environment Minister. I refer to reports that last night, when the minister was told that the former president of Kiribati was in Australia to deliver a message on climate change, the Environment Minister told the former president, and I quote, "I know why you're here. It's for the cash. For the Pacific, it's always about the cash. I have my chequebook here. How much do you want?" Does the minister deny saying those words to the former president of one of Australia's Pacific neighbours and one of the nations most affected by climate change and sea level rise in the world?
The Minister for the Environment.
Thank you, Speaker.
Minister has the call.
Thank you. Today I received a letter from Senator Dodson with his recollection of a conversation. I was very concerned that President Tong, who was in that meeting, actually it was a gathering at a restaurant where I stumbled across this group, went over to introduce myself to Senator Dodson, who I classify as a friend of mine. But I'm very concerned, yes, some friend, I have to say, very concerned that in some way President Tong has been offended in any way, and I believe he's not here anymore. I have spoken to Senator Dodson today and asked him if he was able to provide me with a contact number for President Tong, because I 100% disagree with what he has said was the conversation.
Members on my left.
What I did say is that the Pacific is a very good friend and neighbour to Australia, and in fact that's exactly what I said to President Tong last night. Thank you.
The member for Latrobe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Members on my
question
left,
is to the
Member
Minister
for
for
Latrobe has the call.
Defence.
The member for Latrobe, Leader of the House.
My question is to the Minister for Defence. Will the Minister update the House on why the government believes that national security should be our #1 priority, and what is the government doing to act on that belief? How does this compare to other approaches?
The Minister for Defence.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I
Look,
thank
the member for Wakefield, the warnings don't last for a minute, OK? Leave under 94A, please, and get on with it. The Defence Minister has the call.
That'll increase the average IQ in the chamber, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for Latrobe for his question. Mr. Speaker, we do take national security in this country seriously, unlike the member for Wakefield and unlike the members of the Labor Party. We do take defence and national security seriously. They think it's a joke. They think it's something to make fun of, Mr. Speaker. That's what they think. That's what the member for Wakefield and the Leader of the Opposition thinks. They think that national security and defence is a joke in this country, and that's why they've subcontracted it out to the coalition to do national security and defence in this nation. Some of the members of the Labor Party used to take defence seriously, Mr. Speaker, and they must hang their heads in shame and embarrassment that the member of Wakefield, Leader of the Opposition, thinks it's something to laugh about. Because the most important priority, I was asked about national security and our beliefs. Our #1 belief, Mr. Speaker, in defence is to keep the servicemen and women of the ADF safe. That's our #1 priority. And our second priority is to give them the capability, through the procurement that we make into the Australian Defence Force, to make sure that they win, which keeps them safe, Mr. Speaker. And our third priority is to use that defence heft to grow our economy, to grow our defence industry, to grow our defence industry sovereignty, Mr. Speaker. And that's why this government invested $200 billion over the next 10 years, $200 billion in building that military capability to keep our servicemen and women safe, to keep them alive, to make sure they have the capability to win and to grow our sovereignty in defence industry. And it is working, Mr. Speaker. By contrast, Mr. Speaker, when Labor was in power, they took money out of defence. They'd made big promises. I found, Mr. Speaker, in the Labor Party's election manifesto in 2007, they promised to keep defence spending increasing in real terms every year at 3%. At 3%, Mr. Speaker, until 2016 they made this promise in 2007 that they would keep spending on defence increasing by a minimum of 3% in real terms. What was the reality, Mr. Speaker? Well, the reality, and everyone's heard this number before, is that they reduced spending on defence to 1.56% of GDP, the lowest level since 1938, the last year of appeasement. But I also found out, Mr. Speaker, in 2010-11, and they can shout as loud as they like, in 2010-11 they cut spending on defence by 6.4% in real terms. In 11-12 they cut it by 2.3% in real terms, and in 12-13 they cut spending on defence by 9.2% in real terms.
The member for Eden-Monaro will cease interjecting.
They cut spending on defence by 17.9% in real terms. That's why people trust this side of the House to deliver on national security.
The minister's time has concluded. The member for Port Adelaide.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is again to the Environment Minister. The latest official projection data from the Minister's own department confirms that under the government's policies, carbon pollution will rise all the way to 2030 and the government will come nowhere near its Paris carbon pollution reduction targets for that same year. Does the minister still agree with the Prime Minister that Australia will meet its Paris commitments in a canter?
The Minister for the Environment has the call.
Indeed she does.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. Australia will meet its Kyoto targets. We are well and truly on the way to meeting our 2020 target. Australia is also on target to meet its 2030 target. We have got the full suite, the right suite of climate policies back in 2017. The climate review of our policies said we had the right review. CEFC, ARENA, Emissions Reduction Fund, whole raft. We just recently
Members on my
announced a
left.
forestry plan. We have the policies. We'll meet our targets.
The member for Cowper.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Would the Minister advise the House why the government believes in strong and consistent border protection policies? How is the government acting on those beliefs to keep Australians safe? And is the Minister aware of any alternative policies which would put our border protection measures at risk?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
On this side of the House.
Pause. The Minister's microphone wasn't on. I've given him the call. The Minister for Home Affairs has the call.
Try again. There's a lot of anticipation on the other side, Mr Speaker, I have to say. Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question, and like everybody on this side of the House, we are very much alive to the need for strong border protection, for strong national security measures, as we're seeing in Europe. We have somewhere in the vicinity of 1,400 or 1,500 people who have drowned on the Mediterranean this calendar year alone. We have 14,000 people in Indonesia who would seek to come by boat to Australia tomorrow if they thought that the route was open again. We have people smugglers marketing New Zealand as a destination. Whether or not people smugglers seek to travel all the way to New Zealand or whether they seek simply to make Australian landfall at some point is open to debate. But, Mr Speaker, what we do know is that a government needs to have strong resolve. Before our government, the last government to have strong resolve on border protection was the Howard government. The Howard government took tough decisions, got children out of detention. In fact, when John Howard left office, Mr Speaker, in 2007, 4 people were in detention, including no children. When we came to government, Mr Speaker, 50,000 people had arrived on 800 boats when Labor had lost control of our borders. As the Prime Minister rightly pointed out before, the most tragic aspect of that was that 1,200 people, including women and children, had drowned at sea. And when I speak to the officers of the Royal Australian Navy and Australian Border Force and others involved in Operation Sovereign Borders, they never want us to revisit that policy dysfunction again. They don't want to return to Labor's days where they lose control of our borders, because we know now of the effects. And every day since the last election, the Leader of the Opposition has gently announced a rollback of the Opposition's policy, the Labor Party's policy, in relation to border protection. They don't support temporary visas, Mr Speaker. They don't support offshore processing, and they don't support turning back boats where it's safe to do so. It's in their rhetoric. You know it's in their DNA because, Mr Speaker, they don't believe the success that we've had under Operation Sovereign Borders, and if they are elected at the next election, Mr Speaker, as sure as night follows day, this Leader of the Opposition will follow the example of Mr Rudd and Ms Gillard. People will drown at sea, boats will recommence, children will be back in detention. We have closed 17 detention centres. The 8,000 children that Labor put into detention have been released. We have not had a drowning at sea. On my watch, we are making sure that we are not complacent in relation to the threats that still exist, Mr Speaker, and the Australian public, when they know in their souls that they can't trust this Leader of the Opposition, look no further than border protection policy.
Concluded. The member for Port Adelaide.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is again to the Environment Minister. Last week, when asked how Australia would meet its Paris carbon pollution reduction targets, the Minister said the government would, and I quote, build 1 billion trees. Does the Minister plan on sharing this environmental breakthrough with other nations so they can also build some trees? And what other fantastic forestry sector innovations is the Minister relying upon to avoid real action on climate change?
Members on my right, the Leader of the House, the Minister for Jobs, the Minister for Environment has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm just so thrilled to be getting so many questions on the environment. We love to talk about the environment on this side because we're doing a good job. People can trust us, the Australians. They know they can't trust you. Okay, so building, or I would also say growing 1 billion trees. People may have noticed that going back about a few weeks ago, actually the Agricultural Minister announced the new forestry plan. That was what I was referring to in the media. But, Mr Speaker,
members on my left,
we don't make an apology on this side for focusing on getting electricity prices down. That's what we're focused on, but we can look after the environment and the economy at the same time. And we are doing this in a responsible way whilst growing the economy, and the Australian people know they can trust us to do this. But you can't trust those opposite. What's their record? What are they talking about? They're talking about a 45% emissions target. They're talking about a 50% renewable energy target. You cannot trust them. But don't believe me. Why don't we get some quotes about what other people have said about Labor? What about the CFMEU president said that a 50% RET by 2030 will increase the cost of electricity by manufacturing and householding, whilst being a poor tool to reduce Australians' emissions, overall emissions. Ben David, Secretary of Bill Shorten's branch of the AWU, said
the minister will refer to members by their correct titles.
Leader of the Opposition, almost forgot. The rush away from coal and gas-fired electricity power stations in a little unseemingly in a haste because we're potentially crucifying hundreds of thousands of manufacturing workers. The Grattan Institute said the Labor's claims that prices would go down as a result of a higher emissions reductions target is unlikely to be sustainable, will accelerate plant closures, require higher consumer prices and would be inherently uncertain. Just one more. The Business Council of Australia has described Labor's 45% emissions reduction target as economy reckon. The Australian people know they can trust us with the environment and the economy. They can't trust that.
The member for North Sydney.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Cities, Urban Infrastructure and Population. Will the minister explain why the government believes in delivering essential transport services? What is the government doing to act on that belief by delivering on congestion-busting projects, including in Sydney and its surrounds?
The Minister for Cities and Urban Infrastructure.
Well, can I thank the member for North Sydney for his question? And as the member for North Sydney knows, Australia has some of the greatest cities in the world, which are frequently recognised as amongst the most livable, but they're also amongst the most fast-growing cities in the world, and with that brings some congestion. And residents know this, and we understand this, Mr Speaker. And we have a plan to deal with this congestion, and it consists of a number of parts. The first element actually is having a better planning framework where our population projections are better married with state infrastructure plans, so that in the future we never have the situation where we have a Premier of New South Wales like Bob Carr saying Sydney is full and not building infrastructure, and yet a few years later having Prime Minister Rudd turbocharging the population growth. That's the first part. The second part, Mr Speaker, is a decentralisation agenda. Take the pressure off the big cities and support the growth of the smaller states like South Australia and some of the regional areas who have growth ambitions. But the third element of this plan is a massive injection in congestion-busting infrastructure right across the country. And we have $75 billion worth of congestion-busting infrastructure in every single major capital city occurring right now, including in the city of Sydney. And in Sydney we have important projects such as the WestConnex project, such as the NorthConnex project. We have massive infrastructure spend in the Western Sydney Airport and the development of Western Sydney surrounding that. And these projects, these massive road and rail projects, will help people to be able to get home from work, and so they spend less time in traffic and they spend more time at home. And that's what we believe in. That's what we believe in, is investing in this infrastructure so that you're spending more time with your family and less time in traffic and on the roads. Now, Mr Speaker, we will continue to build this infrastructure. We'll continue to work in New South Wales with the New South Wales governments and work cooperatively with them. And what the people of Sydney need and the people of New South Wales need is they need certainty that we can continue with these plans, Mr Speaker. They need certainty that we will continue to back the WestConnect, continue to back the Western Sydney Airport and these other projects. But what they don't need is uncertainty. And if we want to avoid uncertainty in the future, Mr Speaker, then the people of Wentworth have a very important decision, and they need to back a candidate who will support these congestion-busting plans. They need to back a person who will support our plans and who will back those plans to deal with congestion, to ease the population pressures on the big cities and make our cities even better.
Expired. The member for Batman.
Thank you. My question is to the Environment Minister. Will the government be providing any additional money to the Emissions Reduction Fund, and if so, when?
The Minister for the Environment has the call.
Thank you, Speaker, and thank you for the question. As people will know, an excellent policy of ours that was started with over $2 billion. We're down to $250 million. Of course, as you would expect, a responsible government is looking at its full suite of policies, which will include the ERF. That's not a matter for me to talk about today. It's a matter for Cabinet.
The member for Hinkler.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Families and Social Services. Will the minister explain why the government believes in a fair and sustainable welfare system, and what is the government doing to support families and act on that belief in my electorate of Hinkler?
The Minister for Families and Human Services.
Well, I do thank the member for Hinkler, who's been a very strong advocate for a fair and sustainable welfare system, including through his advocacy, his successful advocacy, for a trial of the cashless debit card in Bundaberg and Hervey Bay in his electorate, something which will be commencing from late January next year. Now, Mr Speaker, on this side of the House we believe in a sustainable welfare system. If, as an Australian, you're entitled to welfare, then you have a right to expect that when you turn up, the government has the capacity to make the promised payment. That means the system needs to be sustainable. Now, under the previous government, expenditure on social security and welfare was growing at 6.2% a year, nearly twice the rate at which tax revenue was growing. That is unsustainable, Mr Speaker. Under this government, social security and welfare spending at 2.9% a year is lower than the rate at which tax revenue is growing. That is sustainable. That is an example of our strong economic management, meaning that we can fund the services that Australians rely upon. And we believe in a fair welfare system, Mr Speaker. If you have a go, you'll get a go. And that's why we're pushing ahead with the cashless debit card. Indeed, last week the member for Hinkler and I had the chance to have discussions about the cashless debit card in Bundaberg. A very impressive young woman I met at a service called Impact. She's undergoing some training at the moment. She'll be moving into the workforce, and she made the observation to me that when people have an addiction, then, quotes, drugs and other habits often come first rather than the kids. That is exactly why we need to make sure that we are providing 80% of welfare onto the cashless debit card. 80% of your benefit goes onto the card. It can't be used to purchase alcohol, drugs or gambling. And the results are very significant. What then is Labor's position on this successful policy? When the member for Jagga was the minister, she consistently supported the expansion of income management to 7 sites across 5 states. The former Labor member for Hinkler supports the rollout of the cashless debit card to the electorate, but sadly now politics has got in the way. The current Labor candidate for Hinkler is running a petition against the cashless debit card. Labor voted against the cashless debit card being expanded to Hinkler, putting politics ahead of a proven policy measure helping Australians on welfare to stabilise their lives and get into the workforce. We will stand up for the values of mainstream Australians, not the inner-city Green left that Labor seems far too responsive to.
The member for Isaacs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. How can the Prime Minister possibly claim that the government voting for a motion that contained a white supremacist slogan was just an administrative error when the member for Dawson repeated the white supremacist slogan in a tweet yesterday afternoon? Has the Prime Minister sought an explanation from the members for Dawson and Hume and Liberal Senators Stoker and Patterson, who, according to today's papers, attended a conference with links to racist hate groups? Was this also just an administrative error?
I won't call the Leader of the House. I can't see how that question's in order. Statements by private members are not the responsibility of any leader. Next question. The member for Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Agriculture and Water Resources. Will the minister explain why the government believes in supporting our farmers? What is the government doing to act on that belief by providing support and assistance, marketing opportunities for the food and fibre producers?
The Minister for Agriculture.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And can I thank the honourable member for his question, because he knows full well the impacts of this drought in particular it's having even on his own electorate of Flynn. And to answer his question, Mr Speaker, quite simply, is because agriculture underpins every regional rural economy out there. It's a $60 billion industry, nearly $50 billion in exports, so it underpins so much. And despite the rain that we've received recently, let me make it clear, one shower of rain will not break this drought. So we'll continue to support our farmers with drought assistance, $1.8 billion that we're putting on the table to help farmers. And I'm pleased to be able to announce that we are now cutting the farm household assistance application by a third. We're cutting it by a third to make it easier. But we're going to complement that with an extra 39 additional rural financial counsellor service. They are the angels of this drought that sit around the kitchen tables of our farmers and help them fill out the forms. They complement the already 116 that are out there doing the job for us. But we've gone further to look for the resilience of this industry to make sure we're prepared for further droughts. I've been able to bring the banks with us on the journey, and now they're prepared to offset farm management deposits against their term debt, saving our farmers tens of thousands of dollars every year. We're also investing in exclusion fencing, improving the efficiency of our primary producers, and also making sure we're giving write-offs for those that want to invest for the preparedness of fodder storage. This is making sure that agriculture has a good story. The story of agriculture is just add rain. And what we want to do is bring our young people home. We've had a generation drain of young people because the story of agriculture has not been as positive as what it has today. And it's positive because of the work we've done around the trade agreements, the big three with China, Japan and Korea. And now, thank you to the member for Moncrief, the former Trade Minister, who put in place the TPP-11, and Peru, putting real returns at the farm gate, meaning that farmers and their children can now make a quid. But we just don't want to bring young people home. We want to bring women back to agriculture. I'm proud to say that we, at long last, are bringing our women home, because the jobs in agriculture are not just the traditional jobs. They are now in research and development and science. We are at the cutting edge of technology in agriculture, and we are taking agriculture to a $100 billion industry because of the investment we are making. But this government has gone further. I'm proud to say that in the last 10 months, since being the Agriculture Minister, I've taken female representation on government boards from 37% to 47%. That's an investment in the women of rural and regional Australia, and we're damn proud to make it.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
Thank the Prime Minister.